Good morning. Thank you for coming to this Great Britain semester presentation. I'm Chad Stebbins, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicoletti, who is in his fourth year of teaching in the Political Science Department at Missouri Southern. Dr. Nicoletti has a PhD in political science from the University of Buffalo, and Missouri Southern is very fortunate to have a professor of his caliber. He teaches such a wide variety of classes in the political science department, ranging from comparative politics to American foreign policy. He's also started a chapter here at Missouri Southern of the Model European Union, which in the spring goes to the University of Indiana and competes against other Model EU chapters. So this presentation is one that we've kind of pointed to for a long time. He's going to talk about Brexit, which was very controversial. The referendum passed last June by voters in the UK. It wasn't expected to pass. It was supposed to fail, and surprisingly, by a narrow margin, the voters approved it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicoletti to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Stebbins. I appreciate it. Is this working? Can everyone hear me well? I think it's okay. So thank you all for coming today to talk about Brexit, which is getting a lot of attention and has gotten a lot of attention since the summer. And it's actually a pretty fascinating topic. And so as Dr. Stebbins mentioned, this wasn't supposed to happen, right? And so all the polls and all the really good representative polls leading up to Brexit showed that the Remain campaign would win. Okay, and they were going to win by a small margin. Usually a lot of the polls were within the margin of error. But it's true, Brexit did vote to leave on June 23rd. And so this discussion is going to be a couple different things here. So I'm going to give a little bit of history on the UK and Great Britain's entrance into the European Union. And believe me, the entrance into the Union was as tumultuous as is the exit. Okay, there's some interesting history in how the EU actually ends up getting into what is known as the European Economic Community at the time. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about what the EU is, and then I'm really going to focus on Brexit. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is an original analysis from something called the Wave 7 British election study, which was taken directly before the Brexit vote. And I'm going to sort of disentangle some of the theoretical reasons people believe Brexit happened, and we're going to look at the empirical evidence for exactly why people voted to leave. And then I'm going to talk about where the two entities are going to go from here. Where will Great Britain go post-Brexit, and where will the EU go post-Brexit, which I think is the even more interesting question. And so where will EU integration lead now that Great Britain is no longer in the Union? So a little bit of history here. This begins post-World War II, okay? And so after World War II, which was sort of the second major war in Europe, okay? And World War II, a lot of people wanted to end sort of this relationship between France and Germany, okay, after the war. They didn't want this to happen again. And so the movements, some of the movements that were against the Nazis and some of the movements that fought for the Allies, they formed this thing called the European Union of Federalists. Okay? And so the word federalism is important here because the idea surrounding what is now the European Union was originally a very federalist idea. Okay? And what is federalism? So federalism literally is the separation between subnational units of government and national units of government like the United States has. We have a federal government, okay, and then we have individual state governments. And so technically, we have 51 different governments in the United States, and you're living under at least two governments at any time. Now, of course, when we're dealing with the European Union, we're dealing with nation states, okay, nation states. And anyone knows, if you know anything about nation states, you know that they value this thing called sovereignty. And so sovereignty is the idea that nation states get to control what happens inside of their own borders. Okay, that's very important. That means non-intervention from the outside. But when nation states enter into things like the European Union or the economic coal and steel community, as we'll see, they have to forfeit some of their sovereignty in order to make cooperation with other nation states work. And so nation states are very, very jealous over their sovereignty, and they keep it very close to them. And so this was demonstrated in Churchill's 46th speech in Zurich. He said he would never, that the UK would support a supranational Europe. They were already talking about it at these terms in the 40s, but that the UK would remain outside of that the UK would not enter that supranational organization. Okay? But they were very pro-Europe, forming it on its own. Well, they meet in The Hague in 1948, and they start sort of the preliminary discussions for what's eventually going to become both the political and economic union for Europe. Okay? And the Council of Europe is founded in 1949, and actually that's something that's still around today. But it was the very first building blocks of the political elements of Europe. In fact, the Council of Europe stands for things like human rights and the protection of parliamentary democracy or representative democracy in Europe to try and prevent something like Germany rising up again or sort of fascist dictatorships in the region. So World War II had a big impact. And in fact, if you know a little bit about this, you know that really part of the European Union's origins is the idea of international cooperation and getting Germany and France to work together to prevent conflict in the future. Well, then we enter sort of the Cold War period. And Churchill makes a very famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he uses the language of the Iron Curtain, right? The Iron Curtain is descending upon Eastern Europe. Also at this time, the Yalta Conference is coming into fruition. Stalin is trying to solidify what gains they got at Yalta when FDR was in a sort of a bad negotiating position because he didn't know that he was going to get the atomic weapon to work yet, and so he kind of gave a lot of concessions at Yalta, and Stalin was solidifying those concessions. One of the big things that happens during this time is the Greece Civil War comes back, and the rebels, or I guess you can call them the revolutionaries, are communists, okay? And Europe is trying to sort of suppress this Greece revolution. The UK is involved in this, and eventually they can't give any more money to trying to keep Greece capitalist. And so as a response, Truman, and what is now the famous Truman Doctrine, responds by saying that the United States will help and intervene whenever outsiders or rebel groups inside are going to try and press sort of communist ideas upon other countries. And this begins what we know as the history of sort of the proxy wars, okay? And at the time, the United States was the leader of the Western Bloc, the capitalist bloc, okay, the Bretton Woods bloc, if you will, which is the international economic order post-World War II. And then the Soviet Union is the leader of the Eastern Bloc, okay, the Warsaw Pact bloc. Okay? And so you get this sort of bipolar world where the United States and their allies are sort of combating or fighting it out with the Soviet Union and their allies, but they're not fighting directly with each other. They're fighting in third world countries, as they were known at the time, like Korea, Vietnam, Greece. Okay? Now, as a response to this, and this is leading up to sort of the European coal and steel community, the United States begins the Marshall Plan, okay, and the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. And what this is designed to do is rebuild, okay, Europe post-World War II. Specifically so the United States can begin trading again with Europe because they wanted a strong European market so that the United States exports could begin to be viable there again, but also to rebuild that Western bloc to prevent communist ideas from rising up, all right? And so we get this sort of the United States involvement. Now the United States is very pro-European integration at the time. In fact, they're so pro-European integration and they're a part of this European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, that the European states who kind of want to pursue integration start to shy away from using the OEEC as the mechanism because they believe the United States has too much power in this. And again, they want to maintain sovereignty. They want to keep the United States from getting its hands in Europe. And so they come up with a plan. It's known as the Schumann Plan. Robert Schumann came up with this. And basically, it was going to be a coal and steel community. Okay, we're going to start small, and what that meant was that France, okay, and Greece and eventually Italy and the Benelux countries would pool their resources of coal and steel and create an economic market over coal and steel. Now, these were very important things. They were very important industries because coal was the energy sector, okay? It made Germany very powerful, and France was worried about a rise again from Germany, okay? Same thing with steel. And so by pooling these two economic industries, this was the beginning of cooperation for Europe, okay? And it was the beginning of what would be known as the European Union. Now, eventually, this forms into the European Cooperation Organization, Economic Cooperation Organization, and the British are invited to begin this process, okay? They're invited to join, and they decide not to for a variety of reasons which are still important today, okay? So, first of all, you got to remember, British nationalism was not discredited by fascism, okay? The British nationalist movement is not necessarily affected by what happens post-World War II, okay? So if you think about sort of the German nationalist movement, it's associated with Nazi fascism. The Italian nationalist movement is associated with Mussolini's fascism. Actually, Mussolini is the inventor, really, of the fascist idea. And if you look at this, Great Britain comes out, not being defeated or occupied, okay? They come out a winner. Prior to going into World War II, Great Britain is definitely a world power, okay, or thinks of themselves at least as a world power, all right? And so a lot of scholars talk about this idea of residual world power attitude, okay? And this is something the United States has to be aware of as well. Superpowers, or large, powerful countries who value their sovereignty and who can also seriously change or influence the world's international environment. In other words, has major influence on military and political and economic elements of the international order. They don't always want to believe that their power has declined, okay? And so in many ways, Great Britain still has a view, the UK still has a view of being a very powerful actor on the world stage prior, like they were during the Empire, which is not necessarily, they're not weak, but they're not necessarily the same as they were. Okay? But this sort of residual world power attitude led them to want to distance themselves from pooling any kind of sovereignty. It's also true that Great Britain came out economically stronger, and they campaigned on nationalism. The Labour Party ends up winning campaigns on nationalism. And that's really not, nationalism isn't really going to be conducive to giving up some of your sovereignty to enter into a cooperative economic union. And then there are some other interesting things here. So like the United States Secretary of State knew about the Schumann Plan before the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain even knew about it, and they were kind of upset about that. And a lot of UK politicians looked at this union, or what could be this union, as sort of a way for the United States, again, to influence European politics, okay? And so this idea of supranationalism was, again, rejected by Great Britain. So what ends up happening? A bunch of really interesting things end up happening, and I'm not going to spend too much time on sort of the rest of the history, but we get a bunch of organizations. It kind of starts off as this scattered bunch of organizations, the most important one here being the European Economic Community. It succeeds. The European Economic Community is, in fact, what the European Union is now. It was what the European Union is now. But there were some competing organizations. You had Euratom, which was an atomic energy community. It fails. It doesn't really take off. You had the European Defense Community, which failed. Okay? And think about the European Defense Community. It was formed to sort of politically organize and coordinate foreign policy. Okay? That's very difficult because on the world stage, nationalist actors and sovereign actors like to maintain their own national interests. Okay? And they like to maintain their own sort of status in the world. And when you work together on foreign policy, that means that you may not always dovetail your interests with other states. You may disagree. Okay? So it didn't go so well. But the Western European Union actually is also a foreign policy union. It's a national, sort of a defense union. And it succeeded, and I say, sort of here, because it was really folded into what is now the European Union. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you stand here, the European Union doesn't do foreign policy really well, okay? They don't do the military side very well. They tried to intervene in the 1990s in the crisis, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. They could not get organized. They could not cooperate. And what ended up happening was the United States really needed to step in at that time. Okay? And if you look at their current sort of policy towards refugees coming out of Syria, the nationalism and the sovereignty, again, has sort of prevented them from cooperating on this issue. In fact, if it wasn't for Turkey taking in so many refugees to relieve the pressures on Greece and Cyprus, there probably would be more problems within the European Union itself. And so we end up getting this, the European Economic Community. This is the sort of the baseline beginnings of a single market. Now, they're not there yet. They're cooperating. They're working together. They're lowering tariffs. They're getting there. And eventually, the UK looks at this as an opportunity. So you've got to remember, if you've got a community of states on the continent of Europe continually integrating and moving forward, if you're a state within Europe, you don't want to be left out of that, okay? Because number one, you don't get to have a say or any influence over where Europe's going to go, even though you're a member of that sort of a country within that area. Okay, and number two, free trade is good. Okay, despite what you may hear from modern politicians in the United States, and even politicians during the Brexit political fiasco, free trade is actually very good for states. Okay, the lowering of tariff barriers and the lowering of non-tariff barriers gives us lower prices as consumers. Okay, protectionism only helps a few. Protectionism helps the industries under which are protected, okay? It helps them be more competitive than they actually are. And so you get direct benefits to a small few that you're protecting, and you're getting larger costs among the whole country because prices will go up based on these sort of competitive tariffs. And so one of the best things about being in the European Union is low trade and tariff barriers. Okay? Because that means you get to sell your goods unfettered to a market of over 500 million people. The European Union right now is the largest economic marketplace in the world. It's even larger than the United States. It has over 5 million consumers. And so if you're a country and you want to sell your product competitively on the world stage, making a deal with a country with 500 million consumers is a very good thing. Okay? Because that means that you can sell more of your product and take advantage of what economists call economies of scale. Okay, so trade is good, and Great Britain wants in on this. And so they actually applied for membership in 1961. Now, a couple interesting things are going on at this time. The economic community is growing. France, and really France, but Germany eventually, becomes the two most powerful actors in the economic community. France at the time is sort of led by former general, or as they called him, General Charles de Gaulle. All right. Now de Gaulle is very much concerned about French sovereignty, and because the French, okay, are the most powerful entity in the EEC, okay, that meant that France got to dictate what the community did, and so de Gaulle was very worried that letting in another member state as big as Great Britain, okay, and as powerful as Great Britain, would erode the sovereignty of France, would take away France's ability to continue to influence the community as it grew. And so they actually vetoed British accession in the 60s. Now I threw this sort of the empty chair crisis. For those of you who don't know what the empty chair crisis is, as the European community grew and eventually becomes the European Union, they start to form political institutions, okay? And one of these political institutions is known as the Council of Ministers, all right? And the Council of Ministers is a bunch of foreign ministers from the economy and foreign policy and other areas that come together to meet, all right, from all the countries within the community at the time and sort of discuss where EU policy or EC policy is going to go. Well, the proposal on the table was to move from unanimity, which means that everybody had to vote yes on something, to something called qualified majority voting, which meant that the countries would get a certain number of votes based on how many citizens they had. That also meant that no one country would have a veto over the direction of European community policy. And France kind of flipped out a little bit about that. Okay? De Gaulle was, again, protecting sovereignty. He wanted to maintain France's role. He was worried that opening up qualified majority voting and letting the other member states have a share of the vote without a veto would reduce his influence. And so France pulls out. Essentially, it's called the empty chair crisis because there were a lot of empty chairs. There were a lot of empty minister chairs, and they were French chairs. Okay? And eventually, the Luxembourg deal was made. And what happens in the empty chair crisis is everybody's given a veto, essentially, over the policy in the European Union once again. It's a sort of an informal veto, but France kind of won this battle. Now, eventually, de Gaulle leaves office. We have some turnover in Great Britain. We have some turnover in France in terms of the politicians. Again, Great Britain wants in. And there is a round of accession. Okay? So accession just means allowing countries into the Union. It's actually a very long process to get in. And so in 1972, Denmark, Ireland, Norway, which rejected it in referendum, and the United Kingdom were all allowed into what is the European community. Okay? A couple years later, Great Britain, UK, they hold a referendum. Basically the exact same referendum that they held in June, except they held it a few years after accession. Okay? It literally was a vote whether or not to stay in the European Union. Overwhelmingly in 1975, 67.23% voted to stay. Okay? And so that's really where we were. And at the time, everyone was on board. This is a very famous picture. This is Margaret Thatcher, and she's wearing her European continent sweater, as it became known, with the flags from all over Europe. Okay? Now, we don't usually think of Thatcher as being pro-European integration or pro-supranationalist, because eventually she turns on that. But like I said, everybody was on board. This was a good thing. It was access to a market, access to lower tariffs, and of course, Great Britain would get to pave the way or influence where the European got to go. The European Union would go as it unfolded. Okay. So what does the modern European Union look like? Well, it actually, believe it or not, looks really federal. Okay. And so it's not a country, definitely not a country. We wouldn't call it a country, but it's approaching a country. It's very close to approaching a country. Okay. Now, to be clear, what we should be clear on is that these are all treaty-based organizations. What that means is they are not constitutional-based organizations. There's technically no constitution like in the United States where all of our institutions are derived out of sort of like this social contract, as we would think of it, in sort of a lock-in way. Instead, these are international treaties where countries have negotiated and signed on to these treaties. And as you may know, international law exists, but it tends to be very weak. And so countries break treaties all the time. There really is no universal force to keep them in line. Okay? There is no police force or military to keep them in line. The world on the international stage is, in fact, anarchic. It is the strong will do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must. And it isn't necessarily something where nation states adhere to treaties all the time. Now, the European Union treaties has a pretty good track record. And so what do you got? You've got the Commission. The Commission is sort of like an executive branch, although it's not one person, it's a group of people. The Commission's job is to come up with policies, okay, to write policies for the European Union. All right? The Council of Ministers, this is like one of the legislative bodies of the European Union, made up of those ministers that the governments from each member state send to sort of negotiate policy that has been proposed by the Commission. The European Parliament, very interesting. The European Parliament didn't always exist, okay? And when it did exist, it didn't always have the powers that it has now. The only truly elected body in the European Union that is not indirectly elected through member states, but instead voted on directly by the citizens of the European Union is the European Parliament. Okay? And they actually now finally have voting powers and have basically a bicameral legislature in the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. Okay? Then you have the European Council, not to be confused with the Council of Ministers. The European Council doesn't actually have that much formal power in the European Union, but it is it's the head of all the member states. It's the prime ministers and the presidents. And so informally, obviously, because this is a set of networking, interlocking treaties, they have a lot of power, because those are the heads of the countries that kind of steer where the European Union is going. And then you have the Court of Justice. Interestingly enough, based on a set of rulings over time, the Court of Justice can actually supersede laws that have been passed under member states, okay? Which is, again, an erosion of some of the member state sovereignty. All right, now, more importantly, or I guess I think they're of equal importance, but these tend to be the things people focus on. The EU has economic institutions, okay? Very, very interesting and powerful economic institutions. So the EU has a full customs union, okay, with their own common agricultural policy, okay, and their own common external tariff. That means one tariff for all of the member states. That means that when you negotiate a trade deal with the European Union as a country, when a country negotiates a trade deal with the European Union, they only have to deal with one trade negotiation to deal with all 28 soon to be less member states, okay? And so what's interesting here is that this is really economically efficient, folks, really economically efficient. Along with that comes common regulations. If you're a multinational corporation, you do not want to deal with economic regulations that are different for all EU member states, right? That's inefficient, because then you have to build cars to specification of Germany, build cars to the specification of France, right, et cetera, et cetera. But under the European Union, you have one common regulatory scheme. So you don't need to do that. You get to build them to one regulatory scheme. You can operate in any of the countries, any of the member states of the European Union, okay? And you don't have to pay the extra costs of operating due to different regulations. That's a really positive thing, all right? Now, the euro. We're going to talk about the euro. There is a 19-member eurozone, and they have a common currency known as the euro. This is probably the EU's biggest weakness at this point, okay? The EU's biggest weakness is probably its common currency. The common currency is problematic for a number of reasons. The biggest problem is because the EU has a common monetary policy in what's known as the European Central Bank, but it does not have a common fiscal policy. That means that European Union nation states can spend as much as they want, go into deficits, okay, run up their national debts, all right, and their only way to get out of economic trouble is fiscal spending. It's Keynesian fiscal spending. Unfortunately, they have no monetary control. They can't lower interest rates whenever they want to, because they don't have control over their own interest rates, because they are a member of the common currency union. So what that literally means is that if you're going to try and grow your economy, you either have to go austerity, okay, which is going to be difficult for some time, and your economy is probably going to even shrink, or continue to spend. And so if you look at like Italy, Spain, Greece, Cyprus, Ireland for a long time, government spending was the way to grow the economy, and because their hands are tied with the common interest rates, they couldn't just deflate their currency like China does, or other countries around the world. Okay, so that's actually a problem, but it's also efficient because the stuff that you buy costs the same amount no matter where you're buying it. Okay, so there's efficiency problems, but there's also international currency issues here. You may know of the Schengen area, okay, which is a complete free movement of labor. It does not include Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Ireland, Romania, and it did not include or does not include the United Kingdom. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the United Kingdom isn't still subjective to migrant labor. They just don't have a free EU passport to go wherever they like. And so really, when you think about this, it's the largest supranational experiment in the history of the world. Hands down, okay? There's never been this type of experiment on an international level ever, okay? This is seriously pooling sovereignty of many, many states together to create a supranational set of institutions, a supranational market, and so it really is one of the most interesting experiments of all time in international relations. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to get right into Brexit now. So what happens? What happens? Well, some things change in the United Kingdom. They change over time, okay? The Conservative Party flips on the European Union pretty quickly, Margaret Thatcher is the head of Parliament, and she negotiates a bunch of deals with the European Union. And part of the deals that she negotiates is this thing called the rebate, okay, where Great Britain pays into the European Union system, they pay into the budget, then they get a lot of money back in opt-outs and other things, okay? And eventually, Great Britain, with that sort of I'm a world power hangover, they kind of resist sort of getting deeper and deeper into the European Union while simultaneously the rest of the countries are doing so, okay? So there's always been this awkward relationship. The EU always kind of wants to opt out of things, all right, because they're preserving their sovereignty. Now, more recently, we've had common currency headaches and crises all over the place, all right? Greece had to have been bailed out 2 times in their huge, huge bailouts, okay? Greece is still not doing all that well. Greece was doing so bad, they had to take out their democratically elected political members and institute what are essentially technocrats in parliament so that they can put in austerity measures, because the politicians knew that if they were the ones to put the austerity measures in, they'd never be elected again because the people were very, very upset at those. And so they put in technocrats in the office to do the dirty work just to get some austerity measures passed. Cyprus, if you've been following this, it came to the point where either the EU was going to bail out Cyprus or the Russians were going to do so with some strings attached, okay? And so Vladimir Putin and the Russians were getting their hands involved in some of these to try and, again, take back some of that old Cold War prestige. And then this discussion here, sovereignty versus credible commitments. What do I mean by that? Here's the problem, and this was the problem I've already kind of described. If you enter into a treaty with other nation states, okay, and there's no mechanism to force you to abide by the rules, then can you actually trust any of the member states to do what they've signed on to do? Okay, in international relations, we sometimes call this a prisoner's dilemma. It's a serious problem because I can't trust you to commit to what you've done. I mean, just look at the pact between the Soviet Union and Germany during World War II, right? The promise that Germany wouldn't invade the Soviet Union, the promise that they would be on the same side and sort of break up some of the spoils, okay? And of course, as you all know, Hitler goes against that pact and invades Russia, the USSR at that time. International relations is very temperamental in the sense that you can't get people to commit to what they're going to do. Now, how do you do that in international relations? So one of the ways to get people to commit, or countries really, we kind of talk about them as if they're people in terms of the unitary rational actor assumption, but they're not people, they're countries made up of people, but you get the point. How do you get them to commit? Well, you have to have some kind of framework of punishment, monitoring, and some kind of cost to breaking the rules. And so there's a huge debate on the sovereignty versus the ability to make credible commitments. There's no doubt that the institutions of the European Union are designed to get countries to commit to the things that they say they're going to do. And when you add the ECJ to this, when you add the Court of Justice to this, the Court of Justice has been given the sufficient powers to punish nation states for not abiding by the decisions. And this doesn't just work for the European Union. If you look at the World Trade Organization, if you look at some of the international relations trade treaties or even military treaties, a lot of them have independent mechanisms to resolve conflicts to keep countries from breaking their commitments. Now, of course, the other side of this is sovereignty, because every time you get into one of these, right, you lose a little bit of sovereignty to the institution that you're signing up for. Okay, then immigration, okay? Immigration is really important for this vote, and I'm going to show you in a minute, excuse me, how important this actually is. And surprisingly, and so far I believe I may be the only person to have this finding, and so this is kind of interesting. My argument here is going to be, it isn't the refugee crisis, and it isn't the refugees that were the problem. It was an economic threat from migrant workers. Those are two very different types of immigrants, okay? So immigrants who come in for jobs, seeking jobs, those immigrants are perceived as an economic threat by a population who perceives them as taking their jobs, okay? Now, a lot of people also argue that the Brexit vote was about Syrian refugees and about allowing would-be or possible terrorists into the country and this sort of fear of terrorism. In fact, it's counterintuitive because Great Britain has actually taken by far the most refugees of any of the member states of the European Union, something like 23,000. Now, unless you count Greece, which can't help but take them, right? So voluntarily has taken them, and you can't count Turkey because Turkey's not in there, but they've taken sort of the most. And so in this situation, you have to ask yourself, was it actually a fear of asylum seekers, or was it a fear of workers, migrant worker immigration that has an economic threat to jobs? And I'm going to disentangle that in a second. And so the United Kingdom Independence Party was sort of the main leader of this movement. People like Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, right? These are the people who kind of led the campaign for Brexit. Part of their argument was sovereignty, definitely. Part of their argument was the United Kingdom needs to release itself from this supranational organization that is undermining the power of Parliament, right? Who is undermining the parliamentary ability to pass laws in our country. And then, of course, the other part of this is the fear of economic threat from migrant workers and immigrants, all right? And then the argument that never made any sense to me, but apparently did make sense to those who wanted to leave, was the accession of Turkey. And I say, really? I mean, if you're paying attention to the accession of Turkey at all, you know that the accession has come to a complete halt because of the Cypriot problem. They have not opened any additional chapters on accession in at least 5 years, okay? And moreover, you have to go through something like 28 to 35 chapters of accession just to get in. Turkey isn't even 10% through the process, okay? And so while they've been talking about the accession of Turkey for a long time, this is just something that scholars and observers of this realized was never, ever, ever going to happen, okay? And it's probably not going to happen for a very, very long time. All right? And so this argument was more of I think a fear-based argument, as is the immigration argument, and their stronger argument was probably the sovereignty argument. Okay, so let's look at this. So the vote was a 72% turnout. Okay, actually that's pretty high in U.S. standards, right? So people in the UK are calling this low voter turnout, low standards of voter turnout. In the last midterm elections, I think we barely broke 32%. Voter turnout. And so this is actually really high, and this is a referendum. Okay, what does that mean? That means that it's not voting on people or voting on representatives. That means that they're actually voting on whether to leave. And so the United States doesn't have referendums or initiatives at the national level. We have them at the subnational level. Missouri has them. And so here's the vote. 51.9% voted leave. 48.1% voted remain. That was well within the margin of error for most polls. Okay, so whenever you look at polls, you got to remember, if it has a 3 or 5% margin of error, it could go either way. Plus or minus 3 means it can go either way. So polls that showed how tight it was were sort of always said, oh, well, it's just going to go leave. Look at the polls. But the polls are closer when you add the margin of error. And there were about 25,000 rejected ballots. So here's the map. Here's the electoral map. You can see the blue is leave. The bright orange there is remain. And so if you break it up, and I know this is probably hard to see, but if you break it up, you can see that only London, okay, and Scotland and Northern Ireland were majority remain voters, okay? That's it. Those are the only regions of the UK that voted remain. And it's not surprising that Scotland voted that way, and it's not surprising that Northern Ireland voted that way, and it's not surprising that London voted that way, given that London reaps a ton of benefits from what is the European Union, okay? And so the map was unexpected by many to come out, at this clear. It's also clear, looking at some of the Lord Ashcroft polls, it was older voters, okay, who were the leave voters. Younger voters very much wanted to stay, okay? So age definitely played a role here. So let me tell you about the crux of my analysis. So I have the British election study, which is very similar to the American election study. They run a panel survey pretty consistently in waves for all of their elections. And so I have an internet panel survey, a very well done internet panel survey from April to May of 2016. This was just done right before the referendum. And so the total N, all the participants, have 30,895. Eventually, after you drop the don't knows, because they include those on there, then you get down to about 9,000, 10,000, which is still, if anyone knows, a huge N in public opinion polling. The American National Election Study, you're lucky if you get about 2,000 respondents when you're all said and done with your analysis. So I've taken this panel data, same respondents over time, which it's important because it's the same people that they're tracking throughout all the elections. I've taken that, and my dependent variable here, or the thing I'm trying to explain, obviously, is vote intention. All right, and so the vote intention on the EU referendum, I've coded it as 1 leave and 0 remain. It's a dummy variable. And so I'm not going to go into a bunch of stats here because I have really beautiful graphs that demonstrate what I've done statistically, okay? But what I'm doing is I'm predicting, this is called a logistic regression analysis, where I'm going to predict the probability of voting leave based on a series of other conditional variables, okay? That is what I've done here. And I think some of the things I'm going to highlight are pretty interesting. So what are my hypotheses? Just quickly, and these hypotheses are based upon sort of the theoretical arguments I just laid out for why the UK voted leave. So one, I figure respondents who favor less immigration have a higher probability of voting leave, right? I also figure that respondents who think the EU is bad for the UK economy have a higher probability of voting leave, okay? I figure that the respondents who actually think Turkish accession is bad and is going to happen are going to have a higher probability of voting leave. I figure that respondents who are more certain about the outcome will have a higher probability of voting leave, right? Because part of the problem with Brexit, as we'll see, is that it's really uncertain. Like, what happens when you leave? No country has ever invoked Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty before. This is new territory, okay? Very, very new. What happens when a country pulls out of the biggest supranational experiment in the history of the world? Does their economy tank? Does the whole experiment collapse, right? Does the euro collapse? These are all really important questions. But you figure that voters who are more certain about the outcome, even though you can't really be certain, but some people would believe they're certain, would be more likely to vote leave. Obviously, sovereignty. People who think that the EU is undermining sovereignty, more likely. And then finally, my hypothesis is that it really is economic threat in the flow of migrant workers rather than asylum seekers. And so they're going to have a higher probability of leaving. So this is called, and I don't want you to get all caught up in this, but I present it for those who are interested in the stats. This is a logistic regression model with 27 different independent variables predicting voters who would want to leave, predicting the probability that a voter would vote leave, okay? And so what I've done here is I've controlled for all sorts of things. I've controlled for their party, okay? I've controlled for UKIP, I've controlled for SNP, the Liberal Democratic Party, the Labour Party. I've controlled for age, I've controlled for gender, I've controlled for race, okay? I've controlled for political attention, I've controlled for a number of different things. So what I'm gonna do, and here's what I've done to boil this down for you, is I've taken the effect of a given variable, controlling for all the others, and plotted the predicted probability of voters voting leave based on the marginal effect of each of these independent variables. So just check it out. It doesn't get so scary once you see the graphs, right? The graphs make it, less scary. And for my methods people who are here, this is what I mean by theory, hypothesis, research method, design, and test, right? This is what we're doing, okay? So here is the predicted probability of voting leave, and of course probabilities are always bound between 0 and 1, right? And you can kind of think of them as a percentage or a probability of doing something, all right? And on this axis here is allowing more immigrants. It is very clear, okay, very, very, very clear, that as somebody says they would like to allow more immigrants into the EU, the probability of voting leave goes significantly down, okay? And so if you did not favor allowing more immigrants into the European Union, your probability of voting leave at the lowest end of this scale is well over 50%. And these dotted red lines here, those are called confidence intervals, and you include those to show how tight your prediction is in the estimation model. And what you're going to find is most of my coefficients and the margins of predictions have very tight confidence intervals, meaning they're very statistically significant in the analysis. Okay? But now check this out. It's one of my favorite findings. Again, the predicted probability of voting leave, but then this scale is allowing more asylum seekers into the country. So look at this, okay? So those who want to allow more asylum seekers, more immigrants are much less likely to vote leave. But those who want to allow more asylum seekers in this situation were much more likely to vote leave. Look at this effect. It's a completely directionally different effect, okay? And it does not come from multicollinearity for those of you who are following along on the stats, okay? Because I checked for that. And so what you're actually finding here is it's not the threat of refugees or the threat of asylum seekers that's causing, or that necessarily had a higher predicted probability of leave. It's immigrant workers. That's really where the actual threat comes from. It's an economic threat, not a violent threat. Although it is true that most people who voted leave thought there'd be less terrorism in the UK if they did leave. Okay, that is true. But these findings are pretty interesting. How about this one? Free trade is bad. If you thought free trade is bad for Britain, you voted exit in very high levels. Okay? Turkish accession. If you thought Turkish accession was bad, so this scale is Turkish accession is good, if you thought it was bad, you voted leave. Okay? So that hypothesis bears out pretty well, although I will still argue that it's so far, Turkey entering the EU is still so far away that this argument was kind of silly. How about this? Sure about what happens. The more sure people were about what happens, the more likely they were to vote leave. Okay? So the more confident people were about the state of UK post-leave, the more likely they were to vote leave. Here, look at the confidence interval around this. It's very, very, very tight. EU undermines Parliament. If you thought EU undermines Parliament, it's approaching 60% probability of voting leave if you're on the high end of this scale. Okay, pretty interesting. And then this is free movement of workers bad. Yeah, and again, yes, if you thought the free movement of workers was bad, you were much more likely to vote leave. Okay, again, economic threat, not necessarily violent refugee threat. English identity. So I ran this model with both British identity and English identity. So British identity is the broader, UK identity, including Scotland, Northern Ireland. The English identity is the mainland identity. British identity wasn't statistically significant at all, but English identity was highly significant. In other words, if you identified specifically as English, okay, you were much more likely to vote leave. And then my favorite one, this is trust in ordinary people, not experts. Okay? So if you said you trusted ordinary people more than experts, you were much more likely to want to leave the Union. And so this is kind of funny because if you know a little bit about the European Union, it's literally a government run by experts. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it. It's regulatory, it's intensive in terms of the number of committees and expert people who are trying to make decisions for the European Union. And frankly, people in the UK were just tired of technocrats. They were just tired of these, what they perceived as sovereignty-stealing, technocratic experts making decisions on behalf of a country that's losing its sovereignty. And so this is a pretty interesting finding. All right? Okay, so the UK voted to leave, and I think I've made a pretty good argument for why. Immigration, sovereignty, okay, and sort of this economic threat argument in terms of who's taking our jobs. But now what do people say after they leave? Okay, so I plotted this from YouGov. It's not as fancy as my Stata graphs, but these Excel graphs will do. So this goes from August until December, all right? And this is the YouGov question. YouGov does stuff in the United States, and they do a lot of stuff in the UK. Do you think Britain will be economically better or worse off after we leave the euro? Worse off is gray. Okay, people think it's going to be worse off, clearly, 41% as of the early October. So they voted yes, but it's going to be worse off. Do you think Britain will have more or less influence in the world after we leave? Less influence is orange. Okay, so less influence. So economy worse off, less influence, okay? Do you think leaving the EU will have a good or bad effect on British jobs? The orange is bad, okay? So a plurality of people think, oh, it's not going to be good, it's going to be bad. So we're going to be pretty bad on influence, pretty bad on jobs, pretty bad on the economy. This is pensions. Most people don't think it's going to have any difference on pensions. This is immigration. So check out, so this is obviously pretty interesting. Do you think there will be more or less immigration into Britain after we leave? Less is the orange, all right? And so 49% believe there will be less immigration. Again, this is a very immigration-centered vote. And if you're following along with the US election, you know immigration is a really good way to mobilize voters for your cause, even if immigration is a positive thing in pure economics, right? So maybe you're following my undertones there. In hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to leave the EU? This is a 45-44 split between the right and the wrong as of early October, okay? Then I want to show you this. So this is interesting. This is regret, okay? I took this from the Wave 9 of the British election study, which was conducted right after the Brexit vote, okay, or actually a couple months after the Brexit vote. So this axis, and I think this is actually really important, this is perceived probability of Brexit. In other words, people who really thought Brexit was going to happen are at the high end of this scale. And people who didn't think Brexit was ever going to happen, even with the vote, are on the low end of this scale, okay? This is the probability of regretting your vote in the referendum. And what you notice here is that people who actually thought Brexit was never going to happen, even if they voted, have pretty good amounts of regret from the Remain voters. So in other words, or sorry, from the Leave voters. So in other words, the difference between the Remain voters and the Leave voters in terms of their regret as they believe Brexit was actually going to happen is there's a pretty good difference. Now, the question is, would it have changed the election? Probably not, but it would have been much closer, okay? And so right now a lot of people are talking about regret, and they're talking about what happens now and how people feel, but you can see that the Leave voters have a little bit more regret if they thought Brexit was never going to happen. What's even more interesting is the Remain voters' regret goes up as they believe Brexit is going to happen, right? So that's kind of odd. That means that someone who voted Remain, as their confidence in the actual outcome goes up, they're more regretful of their vote to Remain. In other words, they would maybe possibly rather have voted Leave. But still, this is an interesting gap. Okay, and then finally, which political party do you think would handle Britain's exit from the EU best? The Conservative is this light blue line, and believe it or not, Don't Know is this dark blue line. And it's basically, the plurality is 29% at this point, don't know who's best to handle it, okay? And if you know what's going on, like Theresa May, very recently, she's the new prime minister, all these secret comments of what she said to big banks have come out recently, these taped comments of what she said to big banks. And in these comments, she's essentially saying, Brexit's going to be bad, right? And so they chose her to negotiate Brexit, and they chose her because of her sort of staunch, she's been a Remainer for a while, but she's also a conservative that was on the teetering. Cameron resigned after this because he made if this talk was about Cameron, it'd be just as interesting because he made a lot of political flaws in his decision to even allow for the referendum. But look at this. Voters don't even know who's best to handle this giant negotiation. All right, so let's talk about what now. Okay? So the UK economy actually did grow 0.7% in the 3 months to the end of June. All right? It's growing. The OECD, who warned of slow economic growth in forecast, okay, they rescinded their warning and they said that the UK growth is going to be okay, but for 2017 they said it might shrink from 2% to 1%. Okay? And when you talk about like developed countries growing at 1 or 2%, that's actually pretty normal now. Okay? So when the United States grows at about 2%, high 1.7, 1.8%, that's actually pretty normal. That's pretty normal growth. So when some politicians say that we'll be growing at 4 or 5%, that's kind of something that's never going to happen. And we can talk about why, but it's not possible in an economy like this. Consumer confidence did not go down, believe it or not. People are still buying in Great Britain. The retail sales are up, all right? Consumer prices are up a little bit, so that's inflation by 1%, but it's mostly on steel, and it's mostly on imports from the manufacturer sector. Falling pound, okay? So I visited Great Britain in 2012, and the dollar was about 60 cents on the pound. It did not go very far, okay? I spent a lot more money than I would have if I would have took a trip right now. So if you're a tourist and you want to go to the UK, now's the best time to go because they're at about 80 cents to a pound, which is pretty darn good. And the Bank of England has cut interest rates. So this is the US dollar growth against the pound for the last 1 year from XE currency exchange. So you can see we're a little over 80 cents, the dollar on the pound. Okay, so a pound is worth about 82, 83 cents right now. That's really good compared to previous UK exchange rates. Compare that with the euro, which is also struggling. Right now, the United States dollar is almost at 91 cents on the euro. Okay, so the euro is still stronger than the dollar, but it's also weakening along with Brexit. This graphic here, this is the Bank of England's base rate. And so you can see, here's the economic crisis. So everything's good. Their interest rates are high, preventing inflation. The economic global crisis of 2008, the rescue stimulus packages to bail out some of their biggest banks, the run on Northern Rock Bank, if you remember this in 2008, they precipitously dropped their interest rates, and they've kept them fairly low, and they had to drop them again to 0.25% as a result of Brexit. And so the Bank of England is definitely hedging their bets in terms of growth. They definitely want to try to maintain growth through this crisis. How about trade? Well, one of the biggest things post-Brexit is the number of trade deals the UK has to renegotiate. Okay, over 50 different trade deals have to be renegotiated in the absence of the European Union. Furthermore, Great Britain can't even begin its trade deals until it's exited, and that's going to take about 2 years. Okay, it could take longer. And so right now, these are short-term effects, right? And it doesn't. I would say that the economy of the UK is not affected harshly short-term, except for their currency. That's pretty drastically affected. However, I will say that the long-term effects are unknown. The Article 50 of Lisbon has not been enacted yet. Negotiations have not happened yet. And frankly, folks, I would argue that the EU is not going to let the UK out of this with a good negotiated deal. They're just not, okay? They're going to have to set a precedent. They're going to have to make an example of what happens when you leave the EU, right? What happens if a member state wants to back out? Because that's something that would be bad for the European Union. And I do not think Great Britain is going to get the best deal out of this trade renegotiation. And not only that, but the EU makes countries it trades with follow the regulatory rules anyway, okay? So just to trade with the European Union, you still have to sign a treaty that says that you've got to follow the regulatory rules. So that's not really going to go away. Worker migration is good, not bad, okay? Economically, most of Europe and most of the advanced industrial nations, their growth, their population growth, okay, rates are very low, all right? And most of the labor that comes out of some of these OECD countries is specifically advanced labor, skilled labor, and that means that there's a shortage of unskilled or semi-skilled labor. That same is true in the United States, frankly, that we have a shortage of underskilled labor. And so if there's a demand for underskilled labor in certain industries, which there is in both the United States and the UK, then migrant workers who fill the demand are good for your productivity of your economy and good for your overall GDP growth. And they contribute to the economy, okay? And so I think a lot of the fears of immigration is sort of a xenophobic us versus them mentality, when in reality, if we looked at this through pure economics, immigration actually helps economies where they're lacking in unskilled workers. Not only that, but the WTO and the most favored nation clause is going to basically make some of these trade deals that the United Kingdom renegotiates sort of moot in a way. And so the EU has negotiated trade deals with all these countries, but it's also a part of the World Trade Organization. And one of the things, when you're a part of the World Trade Organization, and China's a part of it as well, many, many, many countries are, there's this thing called the most favored nation principle. And what that principle says is any deal that I give one member of this organization, I have to give all the members of this organization. And so any trade deal that they make with any WTO country, and there are many, many, many WTO countries, they're going to have to give similar circumstances to the rest of the trading deal. And so their trade deals are going to look similar to what they had in the European Union before they left. Okay? It's going to look very similar to what they had before they left. And I think the biggest problem here, and this is where I'm sort of headed with this, is they have no political leverage in Europe anymore. Think about this. Europe is the biggest supranational experiment in the world. If it stays together, and I'm going to make an argument that it does, if it does in fact stay together, then the direction of Europe is not going to go the direction of the UK. It's going to go the direction of the European Union, and the UK is going to be completely left out of that direction, right? And not only that, but as you're going to see, I think the the integration of Europe is going to accelerate post-UK, not decelerate. All right. Migration remains high. The difference between those coming in for a year and those leaving is still in the 200,000 range. Hate crimes are actually on the rise. This is quite interesting. This graph is from the Home Office data of the BBC. So before the election, hate crimes, pretty steady. This is per person here, basically per 1,000 people. Sorry, it's a rate. After the EU referendum, hate crimes increased significantly, and they have not gone below post-referendum levels. Okay, so this kind of demonstrates some of that xenophobia that might be happening on the world stage, some of that sort of anti-immigration sentiment. All right, so what now? What now? So I already said some of this, but the UK is in a tough position. They haven't actually instituted Article 50 yet. And so based on this, they still got a little while to go before they leave the EU. You have to have sort of at least 2 years of negotiation before you're going to leave. There was a 4.1 million person petition signed to have a second EU referendum. Parliament debated this in September, and they rejected it. Okay? And they rejected it because their argument was the original law that called for this referendum did not set a turnout rate. And so because it didn't set a turnout rate, the petition kind of argued the turnout was low, that they would not entertain a second referendum. So this is definitely happening. Definitely happening. So for the skeptics who say, oh, they're just going to stay in or whatever, and as you just heard Nigel Farage say in the European Parliament, he believes they're trying to force and keep the UK in regardless. This is most likely, with a high probability, going to happen. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. Okay, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think the biggest part of the uncertainty for the United Kingdom is, where does Europe go after this? And so I just want to spend a few more minutes. I'm not sure how long these are going to go, but I'm going to go 1 hour and 15 minutes because that's what my class goes, and I got my class here, and so that's how long I'm going. So I got about 10 minutes left to talk about just where the EU goes now. All right. EU is a sovereignty monger, okay? What do I mean by that? They were just a sovereignty hoarder. I mean, when you really, really think about this, they didn't want to be a part of Schengen. They didn't want anything to do with the euro. They had opt-outs and exemptions all over the treaties. I mean, if you look at how far the EU went to help and keep the UK in, right, and to help the UK keep their sovereignty, they pretty much gave the UK an opt-out of almost all the important mechanisms, including things like fundamental human rights, okay, areas of freedom and security and justice, and of course the big rebate, which gave the UK a lot of money back from the budget that they put in, all right? The UK also had a huge voting proportion in terms of what is the new qualified majority voting rules in the European Union. So it has to be, it's called double majority. It has to be 15 out of 28 nation states voting in the affirmative in the council, and then at least 55% of the entire European Union's population. So the European Union, of the European Union, the UK made up 13% of the EU's population. That meant that if they could combine themselves with even some of the smaller states in a vote, they had veto power in the council pretty much over anything, all right? And so that's actually how it often worked. Denmark, the United Kingdom, and some of the other smaller countries would align together, and they would veto certain things that they didn't like, all right? I'm not sure how many of you follow this pre-Brexit, but they got a really good negotiation deal pre-Brexit. In fact, in the renegotiation, the EU basically said, you're bulletproof in terms of sovereignty, okay? Anything you want to opt out of, anything, we'll give it to you. I mean, that was really the deal. The deal was essentially, you don't have to use symbolic language about European integration. You don't have to use symbolic language about supranationalism. You don't have to participate in the things that you don't like. Cameron got the deal he wanted. And in political science, we call these two-level games. They're games essentially games of chicken where you tie your own hands. You see, the way this works is Cameron allows the UKIP and others to stir up anti-EU sentiment so that he can go into the negotiation table with the European Council saying, if you guys don't hook me up, my people are going to vote out, right? And so he's basically saying, I've tied my own hands. If you don't give me the deal I want, they're going to throw us out anyway. So Cameron got the deal he wanted. He just underestimated what was going to happen in the election, okay? And so he made a couple political follies here. Now, on the European Union side, the UK pays about 12.57% of the total EU budget. So here's a couple graphics here. So you can see, this is total EU contributions from 2007 from the BBC, but the numbers aren't that much different. Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, okay? And they pay it through a bunch of different sources, including GNI-based payments, or what we would call GDP-based payments, VAT taxes, which is like basically a sales tax, and then traditional resources. So the UK comes in fourth. But when it comes to net contributions, in other words, what you pay versus what you get out of the European Union, because you got to remember, you get a lot of benefits. The CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, these payments to the United Kingdom, they were getting a lot of these payments from the European Union to protect their agriculture and other things. When you really take out all net contributions, Germany is number one, and the UK is in fact number two. So they are an overwhelming supporter of the European Union. But generally, we're talking about 3.5, 4 billion euro. That's not that much of the overall budget. It is a drop in the hat for the United Kingdom. Frankly, all the arguments about how much money the United Kingdom was going to save post-Brexit, and all the arguments about how they're going to save something like $327 million a week or something like that, those were all fallacious arguments. And Nigel Farage and all those guys put in there that we're going to put it towards the National Health Service, right, if you followed this. That's probably not going to happen. The public's probably going to be very upset when they learn how much money they're going to actually save from being taken out of the European Union. So what's my point of all this? Well, let me tell you what I think is going to happen. This is based on sort of theoretical ideas of international relations and international integration. So there's a couple different ways to look at this, but I think the best theoretical prism to look at this from is liberal intergovernmentalism. And what liberal intergovernmentalism argues is that really what's going on here with integration is that these are negotiations among states. States still have the power. States still have the leverage, okay? And it's states that enter into these agreements in terms of negotiations, bargaining, and leverage, okay? The more leverage you have, the more likely you are to win at these bargains. But once these bargains happen, there start to be something called a regime that forms. And so here comes what we know as social constructivism, if you will, okay? Regimes are, an international regime is viewed as a set of implicit and explicit principles, norms, rules, and procedures which actors' expectations converge in a particular issue area. So here's the deal. The European Union has a clear regime. Not only does it have a set of political institutions and a set of economic institutions, but it also has a set of norms, unwritten or informal ways of doing things, okay? Just because the UK left, these aren't going to disappear, okay? These institutions, these norms, these principles, they're not going anywhere. In fact, the one country who did not converge around these interests is gone, or at least will be gone, okay? When you take the country out, that's a sovereignty monger. When you take the country out, okay, that argues always pursuing their own opt-out to national interest, what you're left with is the original, or at least the original most powerful actors, France and Germany, who actually favor integration. Evidence, just look at how they treated Greece and Cyprus and the bailouts. Just look at how they kept the Eurozone together with their own money. It would have been unheard of 20 years ago for Germany to bail out and spend so much of its own money bailing out nation states like Greece and Cyprus, okay? That add very little to the EU. In fact, they steal a lot more than they add, right? They take a lot more than they add, okay? But the European Union was still willing to keep them in, okay? And in the Eurozone, which is the most damaging part. And so my argument here in the end is that the struggles that the EU has to go through, the struggles that they've been going through, specifically the common currency crisis, it may be that the absence of the United Kingdom eventually, when this actually happens, will relieve the pressures, and you may see a supranationalist federal integration like we haven't seen before. Okay, so the EU has this thing, EU 2020. Okay, and it's all really, if you boil down EU 2020, it's about fiscal policy. And that's really what they need to tackle. Okay, they need to tackle government spending in their member states to get it in line with the interest rates of the monetary policy of the ECB, the European Central Bank. So here's the big problem with that. Can you really tell sovereign governments what they can and cannot spend money on? I mean, they've already abdicated their sovereignty in terms of monetary policy, which is why they're spending so much money to begin with. Now you're going to tell them no fiscal policy, right? You're going to have some kind of common or unique fiscal policy. I think that the absence of the UK will help in these negotiations moving forward, and that it is very, very possible that as the member states move forward and negotiate, they'll hearken back to an old time when European federalism, not just integration, European federalism was actually debated. And so it may actually be, and I take the minority position on this, not many scholars, I know of one other, has written that Brexit might be good for Europe, okay? But I am the other. I actually think that this could be good for European integration. And so there you go, Brexit, Euro-Skeptics, and EU integration, all done.